The buzzing of the clippers was still ringing in my ears when my daughter-in-law whispered, "She'll never have the nerve to show her face tomorrow." Still, I sat perfectly still in the salon chair, watching silver strands slide down the cape like snowfall breaking apart. As the buzzing grew harsher, vibrating through my bones, I felt the humiliation burn, but not a tear fell. While the stylist avoided my eyes, the clippers screamed louder than any apology they didn't offer. The same buzzing that stripped me bare suddenly became the sound of clarity. That's when I decided, if Vanessa wanted to shame me, I'd make sure every guest watched me shine. We're about to begin, but if you'd like, share where you're joining from. It reminds me this story doesn't echo into silence, it lands somewhere real. Drop it in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. Karen had been quiet all morning, letting the hum of the house and the dry Phoenix air settle around her like a veil. The email from the wedding planner sat unopened for hours before she'd finally glanced at it, tapping her nails against the counter. Mother of the groom hair and makeup trial Thursday at 2 p.m. It was a small thing, one of the many little details Vanessa had been ticking off her list. But she'd put off responding, feeling like a guest at her own son's wedding, a part of the background, someone who existed only in the periphery of the picture that Vanessa was constructing. When her phone buzzed, it was Vanessa, of course. "You'll love it, all the moms are getting freshened up." The message popped onto the screen, bubbly and expectant. Karen set her phone down without replying, simply moving through the motions of getting ready. She could feel it, that knot in her stomach that always arrived when it came time to face Vanessa's world, the world of flawless appearances, perfect poses, and silken smiles that hid every rough edge. Karen didn't belong here, she never had, but she would endure it like she had endured so much else. The salon was cold, the scent of bleach and hairspray mingling in the air as Karen walked in. The place was sleek and modern, all glass and chrome, the kind of place where you felt like the decor was more expensive than the service. She was greeted with smiles, the stylists bright and eager, their voices high-pitched with practiced cheer. "We've got special instructions from the bride," one of them said, ushering her to the chair. Karen nodded, though a part of her felt the familiar tension rise, that sense of being a pawn in a world she barely understood. Still, she sat, letting them lead her. The only rebellion she allowed herself was the quiet defiance of her own silence. A young stylist appeared before her, hands trembling slightly as she clipped Karen's hair into sections. Karen watched the reflection of the girl in the mirror, her fingers brushing over the sleek black comb with practiced ease. She felt the first brushstroke, then the soft snip of the scissors, gentle, cautious. But then the rhythm changed, fast. The clattering of clips echoed in the air. Snip, snip, snip. It was too quick, too sharp. Karen felt her pulse spike in her throat, a cold prickle spreading along her skin. What is happening? Her breath caught in her chest as she realized, too late, the hair was falling, falling fast. Her heart thudded in her ears as strands of silver drifted to the floor like confetti. What did they do? She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. A numbness spread through her limbs as if the world had suddenly gone deaf to her voice. The stylist paused, looking at her for the first time, eyes wide. "Oh, I thought you knew." The bride wanted clean lines under the headpiece. Clean lines. The words sounded absurd in the sterile air of the salon, as if the stylist were talking about some misplaced formality, a misstep in a wedding playbook. But all Karen could hear was the sound of her own pulse thudding in her ears. Clean lines under the headpiece. It was then that she realized, Vanessa hadn't just suggested a trim, she hadn't just asked for a little freshen up. This was a choice, a statement, a public statement, even if it hadn't been spoken. The stylist's hands froze as Karen stood up abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor, and Karen's reflection stared back at her with the stark, cruel truth. Her head was a blank canvas of exposed skin, a smooth, unfinished surface. The room held its breath. For a long moment, no one spoke. The sound of her own ragged breathing filled the space. Karen didn't say a word as she turned and walked toward the door, the quiet chatter of the salon continuing behind her, a buzzing noise she could no longer hear. She didn't question the silence, she simply walked, and as she pushed through the heavy door and stepped into the dry heat of the desert, the sun felt like a weight pressing against her exposed skin. The wind whipped across her face as she held herself together. Her steps measured, her head held high, but inside the humiliation burned. She wanted to break me, but I won't be broken. The question now was whether Jason would even see her at all. The door to the salon slammed behind Karen, the sound sharp and final as though it had severed something vital in her. She stumbled into the heat of the desert air, the bright sun biting against her scalp. Her hand flew up instinctively to cover the raw, exposed skin, but there was nothing there, nothing to shield her from the world. Her breath was shallow, the weight of humiliation pressing down like the dry, oppressive heat. She walked, each step deliberate, as if she could outrun the silence she'd just left behind. She needed to get home, to disappear. But as she fumbled for her keys, her phone buzzed in her pocket. The screen lit up with a message from Vanessa. "OMG, don't be mad, you'll look amazing with accessories." Karen stared at the message for a moment, her mind struggling to process the words, the tone. Her fingers hovered over the screen, her thumb aching to type a response, to lash out, but instead she closed her eyes. Don't do it, don't give her what she wants. Instead, she locked her phone and shoved it back into her purse. Every muscle in her body seemed to stiffen with the effort it took to ignore the voice in her head that begged her to react, to scream at the injustice. But no, that was the old Karen, the one who always kept quiet, the one who always kept the peace. At home, the quiet seemed louder, the soft ticking of the clock, the hum of the fridge, the silence that stretched between the four walls and wrapped itself around her, suffocating her even as she tried to breathe through it. A knock at the door. Karen stood there for a moment, not moving. She could feel her pulse racing as the knock came again, more insistent this time. She hadn't told anyone what had happened, not yet. With a slow, steady exhale, Karen opened the door. Marcia stood there, her face unreadable for a split second before her eyes widened, taking in the new look. The shock was fleeting, quickly replaced by an unreadable mix of anger and concern. "Karen," Marcia's voice faltered, eyes dropping to the smooth expanse of her friend's scalp. Karen stepped aside, letting her in, but she didn't say anything. Marcia's eyes scanned her with the precision of someone who had known her for years. She seemed to be waiting for Karen to say something, anything, to acknowledge it. But Karen just turned, moving to the kitchen, her movements deliberate, controlled. She poured herself a glass of water, then another. Her hands shook, but she kept them steady as she held the glass to her lips. Marcia followed her, quiet now. "What happened?" she asked, voice tight. Karen exhaled slowly, setting the glass down with a deliberate slowness. "She's lucky I didn't bring a scalpel," Karen said, the words flat, almost robotic, but they hung in the air, thick with the weight of truth. Marcia looked as though she might explode, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. "That girl," she started, but Karen cut her off. "I'm not going to make a scene," Karen said, her voice low and controlled. "I'm not going to give her that satisfaction." For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the soft hum of the refrigerator. Marcia was still, her eyes darkening with something like fury. Finally, Marcia spoke, her voice softer now. "She won't get away with this." Karen's lips pressed together, a small smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "She already has," Karen said quietly, "but not for long." The doorbell rang, cutting through the tension in the room like a sudden burst of sound. Both women froze, their eyes meeting. Karen didn't move to answer. The only thing she could hear now was the rush of her own blood pounding in her ears. Then, in a flash of motion, Marcia walked toward the door, her expression hardening. Karen followed her with her gaze, but she didn't speak. When Marcia opened the door, Jason stood there, his face pale, his eyes red-rimmed. He didn't speak at first, just looked at his mother. The silence between them felt like a gulf. Finally, Jason swallowed hard. "Mom," he said, his voice tight, almost a whisper, "I'm sorry, it wasn't." "Don't," Karen cut him off, her voice icy. She was calm, so calm. She had learned to be calm. It was the only way to survive. Jason faltered, his face crumpling with guilt. "I didn't know, I swear I didn't know." Karen's jaw tightened, her gaze steady. "You never do you, Jason?" The silence that followed was suffocating. Jason's hands fidgeted nervously, his eyes darting between his mother and Marcia, but Karen didn't give him the chance to speak again. "Go back to your fiancée, Jason, and tell her I'll be there tomorrow." Jason hesitated, his brow furrowing. You're going. Karen didn't answer. Instead, she turned to walk away, her footsteps echoing in the quiet house, leaving Jason standing in the doorway, lost for words. And for the first time in years, Karen felt something shift within her, a quiet, steady force, one that had always been there, waiting. She had been broken once, but no longer. And tomorrow, she would walk into that wedding not as the mother of the groom, but as someone entirely different, someone no one would ever forget. Marcia led Karen through the door of the boutique like a determined force, her grip on Karen's arm firm and unyielding. The sleek, high-end space buzzed with muted chatter and the clink of jewelry, a world of luxury where the air smelled like vanilla and the promise of perfection. Rows of wigs, mannequins dressed in pristine gowns, and displays of shimmering accessories lined the walls. "We'll get you a wig that'll shut them up," Marcia said, her voice sharp but tinged with a kind of fierce warmth. Karen paused, feeling the weight of the place, the thinly veiled judgment of the sales associates, their glances flicking over her with practiced disinterest. But Marcia was already ushering her to a chair, the stylists circling like vultures. "I don't need a wig," Karen muttered, her voice soft but firm. "I didn't need it before." But Marcia wasn't having it. "We'll try a few," she insisted, pulling a silver-gray wig from a stand. It was sleek, shiny, perfect for someone wanting to blend in, someone who didn't dare stand out. The stylist placed it gently on Karen's head, her fingers combing through the strands. Karen barely recognized the face that stared back at her in the mirror. A stranger, someone who didn't know the lines of struggle carved into her face or the memories that clung like shadows to her skin. She looked acceptable, polished, but hollow. She pulled it off in one swift motion, the wig falling into her lap like an afterthought. "Why should I?" Karen's voice was quieter this time, a question to herself more than anyone else. Marcia, watching, didn't respond at first. Instead, she took a step back and regarded her friend with quiet understanding. "Because you can," she finally said, her voice soft but filled with something else, the weight of possibility. "But you don't have to, that's the difference." Karen stared at her reflection, taking in the starkness of the mirror, the smoothness of her scalp. It was vulnerable. And yet, for the first time in a long while, it felt like strength too, not a mask to hide behind, but a declaration. They didn't linger in the wig section much longer. Marcia, sensing her friend's resolve, led her next door to a tailor. The shop was small, intimate, the kind where fabrics whispered under skilled fingers and every seam seemed to carry a purpose. Karen slipped into a changing room and the tailor adjusted her dress, nipping at the waist, pulling at the shoulders. The garment was altered, the fabric now draped in a way that made Karen feel more solid, more herself. She stepped out, turning in front of the mirror, feeling the dress settle around her like armor. Cleaner lines, stronger shoulders. Marcia nodded approvingly. "You're going to walk in looking like the truth." Karen stood still for a moment, allowing the words to sink in. The truth. She had spent so many years protecting everyone else from the truth, shaping her life around the expectations of others. But now she would walk into the wedding as something different, unvarnished, undeterred, raw. Later that night, Karen sat at her desk, her pen poised over a blank page. She wrote a letter to Ellie, her granddaughter. The words came easily at first, a simple note full of love. But as her hand moved across the paper, Karen paused, her thoughts heavy with something unspoken. She set the pen down. The letter would remain unfinished for now. Some things Karen realized were better left unsaid, for now. Tomorrow would be enough. Karen arrived at the rehearsal dinner, her steps steady despite the weight pressing on her chest. The dry desert air had cooled slightly, the evening settling into a golden haze as the venue loomed before her, an expansive, pristine space full of flowers and white linens. But inside, it felt colder than the night air. She wore the headscarf she'd tied carefully that morning, the silk fabric framing her face with quiet grace, a nod to tradition, a barrier to the world. Around her neck, pearls as small, understated, but they gave her a sense of control, the power to belong in a world she never fully fit into. When she stepped into the venue, Vanessa's smile hit her first, tight, stretched, the edges barely concealing the disdain buried beneath. It was the same smile she'd worn ever since Karen had arrived, a smile that felt like a command rather than a greeting. "Oh, I didn't think you'd come," Vanessa said, the words coded in something like surprise, or was it relief? Karen couldn't tell, and she didn't care to ask. She simply nodded and moved past her daughter-in-law, her presence barely acknowledged. The photographer, a young woman with sharp eyes and quick hands, was already snapping shots of the bridal party. Karen stood by the edge of the group, a peripheral figure just where Vanessa would want her to be. The photographer directed the family shots, calling out instructions as she worked with a practiced ease. But as the click of the camera echoed through the air, Karen found herself moved further and further to the periphery, the edges of the frame. No one said it out loud, but it was clear. She was meant to be invisible. Karen stepped aside for a moment, watching from the corner of the room as the camera flashed again and again. Just like that, the thought came unbidden, "I'm nothing more than a shadow in their picture." Her fingers tightened around the strap of her purse. Jason approached her, his face tight, the lines of stress etched deep into his forehead. He looked at her for a moment, then quickly turned his gaze to the floor. "Can we just get through the weekend, please?" he muttered, his voice laced with frustration, guilt, and a touch of something else, something he couldn't hide. Karen didn't respond. What could she say? Instead, she watched Ellie, who had been sitting off to the side, eyes wide, observing it all. When she saw Karen, her face softened and she ran over to her grandmother without a word. The girl's arms wrapped around Karen's waist, her small frame pressed tight against her. Karen's breath caught in her chest. She could feel Ellie's heart beating against her. Ellie didn't say anything, but she didn't need to. Her hug, tight and unyielding, was a message all its own. The girl wouldn't let go, not for a long while. For a moment, Karen didn't move. She simply stood there, allowing Ellie's warmth to fill the space between her and everything else. The flashing cameras, the whispered conversations, the awkward glances, they all faded away. In that one simple gesture, she was reminded of something she hadn't known she'd been missing. This is enough. This is real. As the photographer shifted to capture another moment, Karen made no move to step back into the shot. Instead, she remained standing at the edge, content, invisible to them but present to the one person who mattered. And when the flash went off again, it wasn't her face they captured, but Karen didn't care, not anymore. The truth of the moment was far more important than any image they could craft. Ellie pulled away, but her eyes stayed locked with Karen's. Without a word, they both knew this was just the beginning. The wedding day arrived, and the morning sun hung in the air like a promise, shimmering against the dry desert landscape. Inside the venue, it was a different world, soft lights, delicate flowers, and the low hum of excited chatter as the guests trickled in. A few murmurs rose up, scattering through the crowd like whispered secrets. "Have you seen the mother of the groom?" someone asked, their voice too loud in the quiet hum of anticipation. "She's not here yet," came another voice a little too eagerly. Karen stood at the back of the venue, just beyond the reach of the polished floors and glittering decor, her heart steady but her breath shallow. The chair where she was supposed to sit was empty, the seat reserved for her, the mother of the groom. But in her heart, she had known she wouldn't be seated there, not today. She had arrived early, not as the invisible woman lurking at the edges of the frame, not as the afterthought. Today, she would make her own entrance. The soft strains of the ceremony music began to fill the space, a gentle melody that tugged at the soul. Guests began to murmur, the hushed voices rippling through the crowd as they took their seats. The photographer, poised at the front, readied her camera, scanning the crowd for the first hints of drama. Then the door swung open. Karen stood in the doorway, her silver gown catching the light in a burst of brilliance. The fabric flowed around her like liquid, its sleek lines and strong shoulders a stark contrast to the softness of the room. Her head, smooth and unadorned, gleamed under the lights, vulnerable yet powerful. The moment was electric. Every head turned like a synchronized wave, eyes widening as the unexpected figure entered. There was no murmur of surprise this time, no polite whispers, just the sharp, collective intake of breath. The photographer's fingers faltered on the camera, her eyes widening as she lifted the lens, capturing Karen's every step with a gasp. Karen felt it, the shift in the room, the power in her presence. The long-ignored woman who had spent years fading into the background now stood, fully visible, unrepentant. every eye was on her. Jason stood at the altar, his face frozen in disbelief. His eyes searched for the woman who had walked out of their shared past, the one he thought was broken, silent, unseen. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Vanessa, beside him, didn't move at first, her jaw clenched so tight it was almost painful to look at. She watched Karen's every step, the tension in her shoulders tightening as the reality of her presence hit her like a blow. Karen took one deliberate step after another, the quiet sound of her heels the only noise in the charged atmosphere. She walked past the rows of guests, her posture tall, head held high, not a single glance betraying the tumult of emotion that raged inside her. When she reached the front row, she didn't pause, she didn't look to Jason or Vanessa. She didn't need to. Instead, she sat with Marcia, who had already claimed a pair of seats in the front row, her own smile wide and knowing. Marcia's eyes glinted with something sharp, pride, satisfaction, a knowing that this moment had been earned. She nodded to Karen, but neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The quiet strength between them spoke volumes. Jason, still at the altar, hadn't taken his eyes off her. His expression was a mixture of shock and confusion, as though he couldn't quite reconcile the mother he once knew with the woman sitting before him now. His gaze flicked between Vanessa and Karen, but nothing could pull his attention away from her. Vanessa's lips pressed into a thin line and the tightening of her jaw was almost audible. She stood a little straighter, trying to regain control, but the once perfect, polished facade of her world was cracking, and it was Karen sitting there so calmly that had caused it. The ceremony continued, but the moment had changed. Every beat of the music, every whispered word now seemed laced with tension, as if the air itself held its breath. Karen's presence had shifted the balance, and they hadn't even seen it coming. As the vows were exchanged, Karen leaned back in her seat, her gaze calm, steady, and unflinching. The man who had once been her son now stood there, lost in the wreckage of his own expectations. And Vanessa, for all her control, would now have to reckon with the fact that Karen would not be easily erased. It wasn't just a wedding, it was a moment of reckoning for all of them. And Karen, she was just getting started. The reception hall buzzed with laughter and the clink of glasses, the kind of polite chatter that was meant to fill the silence but only amplified the tension. Karen stood near the back of the room, the soft glow of the chandeliers reflecting off her silver gown, still luminous despite the murmur of curiosity that rippled through the guests. "What happened to her hair?" one guest whispered loudly enough for Karen to hear, though she wasn't supposed to. Another voice joined in, softer but still clear. "She's stunning, though." Karen's heart beat steady, her breath calm as she watched the guests, noting how their gazes flickered to her and then quickly away. It wasn't the whispered judgment that unsettled her. It was the recognition, the way they couldn't quite understand what they were seeing. The stylist from earlier, the one who had buzzed her head, entered the room and froze when she saw Karen. Her eyes widened for just a moment before she turned quickly, ducking behind a cluster of guests to avoid Karen's gaze. The room shifted. The photographer, trying to regain control of the situation, began to snap photos of the bridal party, but the camera's attention now darted uneasily between Vanessa, Jason, and Karen. It was as if they were all trying to navigate the same space but had been suddenly pulled into different dimensions. Marcia leaned in, offering Karen a glass of champagne, her voice low and steady. "They don't know what to do with you, do they?" Karen smirked slightly. "I think they're figuring it out." Despite the tension in the air, no one dared to address what had just happened. No one dared bring up her bold entrance, her smooth head, the defiance she carried with her. Instead, they made small talk, politely ignoring the elephant in the room, each of them too aware of how much her presence had unsettled the fragile perfection of this day. And then, Ellie appeared, her face soft with admiration. She found her grandmother across the room, and without a word, her eyes lit up, her lips curving into a smile. She made her way to Karen, her small hands reaching out, her words forming in her eyes before her mouth spoke them. "You look amazing," Ellie mouthed silently, her gaze full of something tender, something beyond the surface of the room. Karen's chest tightened at the unspoken exchange. She gave a slight nod, her eyes meeting Ellie's for a long beat before the girl was swept away into the crowd, her words still echoing in Karen's mind. Vanessa, by contrast, refused to acknowledge her. The photographer tried to set up another family shot, positioning Karen briefly beside the groom's side, but Vanessa stiffened immediately, moving slightly out of frame whenever Karen came near. Karen didn't flinch, she wasn't going to disappear again. As the photographer snapped yet another photo, Karen positioned herself deliberately in the center of the shot. She turned slightly, striking a pose as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Proud, unapologetic, her eyes held steady with the camera, her body angled with ease, and for just a moment she forgot about the whispers, the avoidance, the judgment. "This is my space now." The photographer hesitated. The click of the camera captured her unflinching stance. It was a moment of clarity in a whirlwind of pretense. Karen knew it, the room knew it, and even Vanessa, standing off to the side, knew it too. The scene was what Vanessa had envisioned, but Karen didn't care. This wasn't her wedding, this was her moment, and she was going to make it last. As the flashes from the camera filled the room, Karen caught Jason's eye, his face a mix of disbelief and confusion. But she held his gaze, unwavering. His uncertainty was no longer her problem. The quiet air between them thickened, heavy with a question that would hang unanswered in the air for the rest of the night. Karen sat at the distant side of the room, the farthest she could get from the wedding party without being completely out of sight. The long banquet table stretched before her, a sea of white plates and crystal glasses, the clink of silverware and the murmur of polite conversation buzzing through the air like flies that wouldn't land. She had been placed there, of course, isolated, a quiet reminder that she wasn't truly welcome in the picture they were trying to frame. She smoothed the edges of her silver gown, the fabric catching the light in delicate waves. The contrast between her and the sea of guests around her couldn't have been clearer. She was an outsider here, but she had learned to own it. Across the room, the rest of the family gathered, their chatter a dull hum, as Jason and Vanessa stood at the center. Jason, still unable to meet her eyes, looked like he might snap at any moment, caught in the tension of trying to maintain some semblance of normality. Vanessa, however, was the picture of composure, her smile a perfect curve as she rose to give a speech. The room fell silent. "Family blending," Vanessa began, her voice smooth and rehearsed, the words carefully chosen as if they were meant to smooth over the ruffled edges of this day. "It's all about unity, about coming together, and about moving forward no matter what challenges we face." Karen's eyes never wavered as she heard the words. The absence of her name hung in the air like a stain, but Karen didn't need to be acknowledged to know what was happening. Vanessa spoke around her, her polished image too fragile to risk cracking in front of the guests. Karen wasn't worth mentioning, not in her version of the story. But Karen's hands remained steady as she clapped politely when the speech ended. A soft, even applause, as if she were just another guest in a room full of strangers. Then she returned her attention to her plate, unfazed as the guests around her continued to gossip in low murmurs. The whispers had quieted since her entrance but not disappeared. Now, as the evening stretched on, the eyes that once turned away were lingering longer, some openly admiring her. Karen didn't look up, didn't seek out approval. It wasn't for them, it never had been. A soft thud broke her thoughts. She looked up to see Ellie standing in front of her, a small Polaroid camera in hand, her face flushed with excitement. "I want a picture of just you," she said, her voice full of that untainted sincerity that only children seemed capable of. Karen's breath caught in her chest, a sharp ache rising within her. She had come here expecting to be erased, but Ellie's presence was like a breath of fresh air, pure, untarnished by the world's expectations. Karen nodded, the smallest of smiles tugging at her lips. "Okay, sweetheart, let's do it." Ellie raised the camera, her small hands shaking with excitement. The flash went off, bright and sudden, and for a moment everything else in the room faded. The cameras, the whispers, the absence of her name, none of it mattered in this instant. It was just her and Ellie, alone in their space, caught in the timelessness of this moment. The photo developed slowly, revealing a snapshot of Karen, not the broken woman they thought she was, but someone else entirely, someone they hadn't expected. Ellie beamed, holding the photo up for Karen to see. "I want to keep it," she said, her voice soft but firm. Karen smiled back, but her eyes were distant, focused somewhere beyond the wedding reception, beyond the photo, beyond the people who had tried to reduce her to nothing. "This is my truth." And for the first time in years, Karen realized how easy it was to be seen. Karen sat at her side table, the one they'd relegated her to, though it no longer mattered. She was far from the bridal party, tucked into the quiet corner where her very presence felt like an afterthought. But her head was high, her posture unyielding. She had always known how to survive. In the shadows, but tonight the shadows didn't seem to reach her. Tonight she was the one casting them. As the clinking of cutlery and the hum of whispered conversations surrounded her, Karen caught a groomsman's stare from across the room. His gaze lingered, as if searching for something, and when their eyes met, he leaned slightly forward as if the moment had been building for some time. "Whatever happened," he said in a low voice, his eyes sweeping over her smooth head, the stark contrast of her silver gown, the quiet power in her demeanor. "You're working it." Karen didn't flinch. Instead, she raised an eyebrow, a slow smile tugging at her lips. There was something in the way he spoke, something like admiration or maybe a kind of reluctant respect. He didn't see the woman who had been humiliated. He saw the one who had stepped back into the light, even if it wasn't supposed to be her place. Before she could respond, Marcia leaned in, her voice full of knowing mischief. "You're trending at table 9, she said, her eyes sparkling. Karen chuckled softly. She could feel the eyes of the room still lingering, the quiet undercurrent of admiration now undeniable. It wasn't just the look, the gown, or the unshaven scalp. It was the unspoken strength that rippled outward, the refusal to be erased. Vanessa, meanwhile, was circling the room, her face frozen in a mask of tight composure. Karen watched her for a moment, the way her gaze darted uneasily between tables, trying to hold everything together, trying to keep the delicate illusion from cracking. The way her lips trembled as she smiled, as though each corner of her mouth was fighting against the weight of her own discomfort. It was the mask of control slipping, and Karen savored it from her distant vantage point. As Karen sat back in her chair, an older couple approached her, their faces warm and familiar. They leaned in, asking about her health, about the years spent raising Jason, about the life she had lived outside the glossy facade of the wedding. Karen spoke with ease, her voice calm, grounded. The room had expected her to break, to shrink. But she had chosen instead to simply exist, unperturbed, even amidst the silence of the ignored. The older man smiled warmly, his hand brushing her shoulder lightly. "I always thought you were the strong one," he said, his voice rich with sincerity. "I can see it now. Still, you're the one who makes us all feel like everything's gonna be all right." Karen's smile deepened. "It's a gift," she said lightly, though there was a truth in it she hadn't quite realized until now. The world had taught her how to hold everything, the quiet pain, the sacrifice, the silences no one dared to hear, but she had never let it break her. And now, in this room, in the stillness of their misplaced assumptions, she was untouchable. Jason finally approached, his face drawn, his posture stiff as he walked toward her. He looked like he might say something, his mouth opening, then closing again. He shifted on his feet, his hands clenching and unclenching. A weak attempt to apologize, perhaps, but Karen already knew what he was going to say. "You could have warned me," he said, his voice tight, "about the hair, the..." She raised a hand, cutting him off before he could say anything else. There was no need for explanations, no need for half-hearted apologies that always came with strings attached. "I could have," she replied, her tone even, "but then you'd have made me stay home." Jason's face faltered, the realization hitting him like a quiet wave too slow to outrun. He opened his mouth again, but nothing came out. His eyes darted from her to the rest of the room, caught in the space between what he had expected and what had actually happened. Karen didn't wait for him to find his words. Instead, she turned her attention back to her plate, her focus returning to the food in front of her, but not the way she used to, as if trying to blend in. No, this time she ate without pretense, unbothered by the eyes that still lingered on her. In the silence that followed, the room seemed to settle around her, the hum of conversations still distant but no longer as loud. The world had expected her to crumble, to beg for acceptance, to retreat into the shadows. But Karen didn't bend, she didn't shrink, she was still here. And she was more than enough. Vanessa moved on, still trying to regain some semblance of control, but Karen didn't care. She had already claimed her space, already staked her claim in this room. And no one, no matter how many whispers and glances they threw her way, could ever take it from her. Jason's quiet defeat was the final confirmation of that truth. The night stretched on, but Karen wasn't looking for approval. The only thing she needed was the calm certainty of knowing she had already won. The night was shifting, but Karen remained anchored in the quiet storm of the reception. The whispers had faded, but the weight of their curiosity still lingered in the air. Karen didn't need to look up to know that the room was still divided, still unsure of what to make of her, but in that moment none of it mattered. She sat back in her chair, her calm unbroken, her movements measured and deliberate. The only thing she'd had to reclaim tonight was her dignity, and that was already in her hands. Reaching into her clutch, she retrieved her phone, the glow of the screen illuminating her face as she tapped out a quick message. The stylist's words, so careless and dismissive earlier that day, still clung to her mind like a scar she hadn't asked for. She didn't have to make a scene to expose the truth. Karen attached the message to the wedding planner, her fingers tapping quietly as if the act itself was a quiet rebellion. She added a note at the top, "For your records." The email sent, the quiet hum of the reception enveloped her again. But this time there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere. A ripple ran through the staff, the murmurs among the waiters and caterers growing louder, then quieter as they passed the news along like a secret. "Wait," someone whispered, looking at their phone. It wasn't a mistake. Within the hour, it was no longer just the staff who were talking. The wedding planner caught Vanessa's attention from across the room, her face tight, her voice low but urgent. Vanessa's posture faltered for a split second, her perfect facade slipping as she listened, her eyes darting quickly toward Karen. The tension in the room thickened. Jason, standing at the far end of the hall, caught part of the conversation. His brow furrowed and his gaze quickly snapped to Karen, confusion settling over his features. His eyes darted from the planner to Vanessa, then back to Karen, as if the pieces were slowly beginning to fall into place. But he didn't approach her. Instead, Ellie found her, a small figure appearing at Karen's side with a crumpled napkin in her hand. Karen didn't need to ask. "She's crying in the bathroom," Ellie whispered, her eyes wide with a mix of concern and confusion. Karen's lips pressed together, her voice soft but firm. "I didn't have to raise my voice," she said, her gaze fixed firmly ahead, not looking for sympathy. "I just didn't lie." Ellie blinked, her eyes softening with a quiet understanding. She didn't ask questions, she simply accepted the truth, one that was unfolding around them, hidden from everyone else but now impossible to ignore. And as the night carried on with the distant sound of clinking glasses and muffled conversations, Karen felt a quiet satisfaction settle deep in her chest. The truth had always been in her hands, it just needed to be revealed on her terms. In the quiet aftermath, there was no need for words. The truth, in all its silent power, had already exposed everything that needed to be known. The last course had been cleared, and the soft chatter of guests lingered like an undercurrent in the air. The clinking of silverware on plates had tapered off, replaced by the occasional scrape of chairs being pushed back as people settled into their final conversations. The dim lights cast shadows over the crowd, a quiet anticipation hanging in the air, broken only by the low hum of the DJ's equipment being tested. Then the microphone crackled, cutting through the murmur. "All right, folks," the DJ said with a grin, his voice amplified through the speakers. "It's time for some toasts. Who's got a few words for the happy couple?" Silence, the kind of stillness that fills a room just before something uncomfortable happens. A moment where you could feel the tension in the air, like everyone was holding their breath, waiting for someone else to take the first step. Karen sat at the far side of the table, her glass of water untouched. Marcia, seated beside her, tapped her glass lightly with a finger. The sound was sharp, the invitation clear. Without a word, Marcia gestured to Karen, her eyes steady and knowing. Karen's heart skipped. The room seemed to shrink for a moment, the laughter dying down in the wake of Marcia's subtle command. All eyes shifted toward her, some filled with curiosity, some with dread, and others, she noticed, with something else entirely. She hadn't planned this, she hadn't intended to speak, hadn't even thought about what she would say if it came to this. But somehow the moment had come and it was hers. Karen rose slowly, her gown shimmering under the soft light as she moved through the space. The room quieted in response, the hush of expectation thick around her. She didn't need the microphone, her voice, steady and soft-spoken, carried without effort as she addressed the room. Thank you all for being here tonight, she began, her gaze sweeping across the crowd, meeting each person in turn. Thank you for supporting Jason, for helping him become the man he is today. Her eyes lingered briefly on Jason, who sat at the head table, his face tight, unsure. She didn't acknowledge him directly, but he couldn't help but feel the weight of her words. Raising him taught me strength, sacrifice, and silence, Karen continued, her voice calm, almost matter-of-fact, though there was an unmistakable sharpness to the last word. The silence she had borne for years, the silence she had chosen not to break, not until now. There was no need to mention Vanessa by name. Her presence had already been felt in the room, in the way people shifted uncomfortably, in the way the guests now looked between her and Karen. Karen's meaning was clear, even without saying a word. The applause was hesitant at first. A few scattered claps, unsure, polite, but it grew slowly, with a few more sincere voices joining in, until there was a smattering of applause that filled the air like a quiet acknowledgement. Some didn't know what to make of it, but a few, Karen could see them, understood exactly what she was saying. Jason's face flushed slightly, his hands resting at his sides, unsure of what to do with himself. He didn't say anything, didn't move. His gaze was locked on her, and the regret in his eyes was palpable, though unspoken. Karen nodded once, a small gesture of finality. She didn't wait for any more reaction, she didn't need it. She had said what needed to be said. She turned and returned to her seat, the room still lingering in the soft aftershock of her words. But Karen didn't care. She had found her voice, and in that moment it had cut through all the noise of the evening. The silence she had endured, the silence she had chosen, was now hers to wield. As she sat back down, Marcia raised her glass toward her, her expression one of quiet admiration. Karen smiled back, a fleeting, knowing smile. There was no need to speak any further. The message had been delivered, and it would resonate far longer than any speech or applause ever could. The night carried on, but Karen knew without a doubt that she had shifted the balance. It wasn't the wedding that would be remembered, it was her. The night stretched on, and the buzz of the wedding reception returned to its rhythmic hum, but Karen remained still, settled into the weight of her words. She had spoken. She had been heard. As she sat back in her seat, Ellie appeared at her side, her small figure peeking over the edge of the table. There was something hopeful in her gaze, something childlike and tender that made Karen's heart soften. "Grandma," Ellie whispered, her voice a quiet urgency, "please, please get a shot of us, just us." Karen looked up, surprised, but Ellie was already pulling the Polaroid camera from her bag, her small hands almost trembling with excitement. Karen smiled softly, nodding, and the two made their way toward the photographer, a young woman now fully aware of the undercurrent of tension that had built over the evening. Ellie stood beside her grandmother, her hand gently wrapped around Karen's arm. The photographer, sensing the moment, smiled, the lens ready to capture something deeper than just a posed picture. Karen didn't hesitate, her posture was effortless, regal even, her bald head catching the light just so, reflecting the quiet strength she had carried through this entire night. Ellie squeezed her arm tighter, her warmth a sharp contrast to the coolness of the room. The flash went off, capturing a moment of clarity and truth. A mother and granddaughter, bound not just by blood but by something unspoken. The camera froze the image, Karen smiling, confident, unbowed. Ellie's young face bright with admiration, her arms wrapped tight around her, as if she were holding the entire weight of the world together. The photographer lowered her camera, eyes wide with the realization of what she had just captured. "This is, wow, can I use this for my portfolio? It's stunning." Karen paused, a beat of hesitation before her lips parted with a soft but steady response. "Yes, it's yours." Marcia, who had been watching from a distance, leaned in with a knowing smile. "That photo's going to outlive the marriage," she remarked, her voice low but the implication sharp. Karen's lips twitched into a smile, but she said nothing. A few hours later, the photo would make its way onto social media, shared by the photographer, her portfolio growing with the quiet power of the image. The caption read simply, "Strength looks like this." Vanessa, much later that night, would see it, sitting alone at the bar nursing a glass of wine. Her eyes would narrow as she clicked open the post, her lips pressing into a thin line. She'd stare at the photo of Karen, proud, unbroken, the smooth shine of her scalp gleaming with defiance. Vanessa's grip tightened on her wine glass and her jaw clenched so hard it was almost audible. But she didn't say anything. Instead, she simply stared at the image, the silence between her and the glowing screen louder than any words could ever be. In the corner of the room, a small smile played on Corinne's lips. She had shown up not just to the wedding but to the world. She had reclaimed the image they'd tried to erase, and it would never be forgotten. Not now, not ever. The air outside the reception hall was cool, a soft breeze carrying the scent of desert flowers and dry earth, a stark contrast to the tension that had built up in the room. Corinne stood by the garden gate, her heels clicking on the stone path, the silver of her gown gleaming faintly under the dim garden lights. She wasn't sure why she had come out here, maybe to escape the weight of the unspoken, or perhaps because she knew that sooner or later, Jason would follow her. The door to the garden opened, and she didn't have to turn around to know who it was. His footsteps, heavy with uncertainty, told her everything she needed to know. Jason approached, the crease between his brows deepening with every step, his shoulders stiff as if preparing for some kind of battle he wasn't sure he was ready for. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She could feel the conversation hanging in the air, thick and inevitable. He came to a stop beside her, standing just out of reach but close enough for her to feel the weight of his presence. "Mom," he started, his voice tight. "She said it was a prank, that she thought it would be funny." Corinne let out a small, bitter laugh, her lips pressed together, holding back something deeper, something more painful. She didn't turn to look at him, didn't need to. His words were just that, words, empty. His eyes searching her face were the only thing that told her he was looking for some kind of redemption. But there would be no easy forgiveness tonight, not from her. "So did I," Corinne said, her voice quiet but steady, "when you married her." Jason flinched. It wasn't an accusation. It was simply the truth. The words had been there for years, buried under layers of silent tolerance. But tonight they had broken free, and now they hung in the air between them, heavier than anything he could say in response. Jason shifted on his feet, his jaw working as if he could say something that would fix them, but nothing came. Instead, he closed his eyes for a moment, exhaling slowly. "I don't know how it got this far," he said, his voice strained like he was speaking from somewhere deep inside the fog of guilt. Corinne didn't answer immediately. She just stood there, the night wrapping itself around her, her fingers tight at her sides. The cool breeze was the only thing that felt constant. "It got this far," she said, her voice low and unshaken, "because you were always afraid of being embarrassed, of making waves." Jason's face tightened and he opened his mouth as if to argue, but no words came out. Corinne didn't look at him. She kept her gaze forward, focusing on the sliver of moonlight that filtered through the trees. "Do you really think this was about me being embarrassed?" she asked, her voice now colder, sharper, though still controlled. "I've spent my life making sure you didn't have to deal with that. I've swallowed my pride, my silence, my dignity for years, but not anymore." Jason stepped closer, his voice cracking, a desperate edge creeping in. "I never wanted this for you. I didn't mean for it to get this far. You have to understand that." Corinne finally turned to face him, her gaze direct. She hadn't allowed herself to look at him for so long, not truly. Now she saw him, saw the weight of years of conflict that had never been addressed. He looked tired, broken in ways she hadn't seen before, but he wasn't the one who had to pay the price anymore. "No, Jason," she said, her voice steady, though the emotion that had been suppressed for so long now leaked through. "I don't think you do understand. You never did. You've always kept your head down, trying to avoid the confrontation. You always made sure it wasn't your problem, but it's been my problem all along." Jason stood there, the silence between them heavy with the weight of all the years they had spent avoiding this conversation. He opened his mouth to speak again, but no words came. Corinne didn't cry, she didn't scream. There were no tears, no dramatics, no breaking down. She had learned long ago that silence was her power, and tonight her silence was the final answer. Jason's gaze flickered to her, and for the first time in years, Corinne saw the real regret in his eyes. But it wasn't enough. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of being his savior, not anymore. "I never wanted you to be the villain in my story," Jason said, his voice barely a whisper, like he was speaking to himself as much as to her. Corinne met his eyes, but there was no forgiveness there, no softening. She simply looked at him, calm, steady, a quiet resolution in her chest. "You're not the villain," she said, her voice a finality, "but I'm done pretending I'm the hero of yours." The quiet of the garden stretched between them, and for the first time there was nothing more to say. They both knew it, something had closed between them that could never be opened again. The drive home was quiet, the night stretching out before them like an endless road. The desert air was cool now, and the headlights of the car cut through the darkness, casting fleeting shadows on the barren landscape. Corinne's hands gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles pale, but her thoughts were elsewhere. Ellie sat beside her, her small frame dwarfed by the passenger seat, her gaze fixed out the window. She hadn't said much since the wedding, her young eyes wide with the weight of everything she'd witnessed. Corinne wasn't sure what Ellie had processed, but the bond between them had shifted. It was unspoken but palpable, the kind of quiet understanding that only time could forge. When they arrived home, the house was still and familiar. The air inside felt different now, less heavy, as though the weight of the evening had lifted, even if only for a moment. Corinne set her keys down on the counter, and Ellie followed her into the kitchen, where Corinne had already begun to make cocoa, a quiet ritual she shared with Ellie after long days. "Grandma," Ellie said softly, pulling her gaze from the window to look at Corinne. Her voice had a quiet, serious edge, one that made Corinne pause as she stirred the milk on the stove. "When I grow up, I want to look like you." Corinne turned to face her, a slow smile tugging at her lips. There was something about the way Ellie spoke, as if her words were more than just praise but a quiet declaration of solidarity, of understanding. Corinne nodded slowly, her hands pausing in their movements. "You already do." The cocoa was ready, steaming in 2 mugs, the warmth rising between them as they settled into the small kitchen table. The house felt smaller. Now, the space between them shrinking as they shared the simple comfort of the moment. Corinne felt the familiar ache, the weight of everything she had carried for so long, but there was something different now. There was peace in the silence, a calmness in her chest. After a long pause, Corinne reached into her bag and pulled out the letter she had written before the wedding. She had never meant to give it to Ellie, but something about the night, about the way things had shifted, told her it was time. She unfolded the paper slowly, handing it to Ellie. "Read this," she said quietly. "It's for you." Ellie took the letter in her small hands, her fingers trembling slightly as she unfolded it. Corinne watched as Ellie read, her lips moving soundlessly over the words Corinne had written so many years ago, a letter meant for a time neither of them had ever imagined. The words were simple, filled with the quiet wisdom of a woman who had lost so much but never lost herself. And then Ellie came to the end of the letter. At the bottom was a photo, an old black-and-white image of Corinne from years ago when her mother had passed. Corinne's head was shaved, but her expression was unchanged, strong, defiant, unbroken. A woman who had stood and kept standing even when the world had tried to break her. Ellie's breath caught in her throat as she looked at the photo. "Is this?" Ellie whispered, her voice filled with awe. Corinne nodded, her eyes soft as she watched Ellie process the image. "After my mother passed," Corinne said quietly, her voice a steady reminder of everything she had endured, "I didn't think I could survive, but I did, and you will too." Ellie smiled up at her, a small, knowing smile. "It runs in us," she said softly, her voice thick with understanding. Corinne felt a knot tighten in her chest, a bittersweet mixture of pride and sorrow. "Yes, baby," she whispered, "it does." The quiet filled the room once more, but this time it was different. It wasn't the silence of isolation or endurance. It was the silence of knowing, of legacy, of strength, and of a bond that could never be broken. Corinne reached across the table, her hand resting lightly on Ellie's. In that moment, there was no need for more words. The truth of their connection was enough. The truth of their shared strength was more than enough. Tomorrow would come and the world would keep spinning, but tonight, Corinne had everything she needed. She had Ellie, she had her peace, and she had the knowledge that the legacy she had built, the strength she had forged, would live on in the next generation. And that was a victory no one could take away from her. The morning light streamed through the windows as Corinne sipped her coffee, the warmth of the cup spreading through her fingers, a comforting routine that had begun to feel normal again. The day had started like any other, quiet and still, but that was before she opened her phone. The notification came in from a breast cancer awareness page she followed, one she had joined after years of working with patients, one she had grown to trust. The message was simple, the picture striking. The photo of her and Ellie, the one taken after the wedding, now lit up her screen. It was the image that had gone viral. The photo that had been shared without permission but with such force that it was now a symbol to many: strength, resilience, dignity. The caption read simply, "Strength looks like this." Corinne's fingers hovered over the screen, the words like an echo in her mind. There had been no talk of cancer, no reference to a fight she hadn't chosen to have, but the impact of the image was undeniable. Thousands of comments flooded in. Incredible. This is how we should all age. Grace and strength. A real woman, a real role model. Dignity in the face of hardship. Her heart clenched, but this time it was different. The weight of these words, these opinions, felt right. This was who she was, not just a mother or grandmother, not just a woman tied to the history of someone else's expectations, but herself. Across the room, Marcia was sitting with her, watching the same post roll in. They both read the comments in silence, the room full of quiet understanding. "I never thought something like this would be this," Marcia said, her voice low with admiration. The impact was immediate. Soon after, Vanessa's curated wedding photos started circulating. She had posted the images that had been meticulously chosen for their polished perfection. Yet, as the comments started to come in, the attention slipped away. Few even noticed the glossy wedding shots. It wasn't about the perfect, controlled moments anymore. Corinne's phone buzzed again. It was a package from the photographer. She opened the box carefully, pulling out the framed print. The photo of her and Ellie, their smiles forever frozen in time. There was a letter of thanks from the photographer, a small note tucked inside. "I knew this would be more than just a photo." It read, "Thank you for allowing me to capture it." The weight of the frame in her hands felt grounding, like a tangible acknowledgement of something deeper, something that no one could take away from her. Then her phone rang. Jason's name flashed across the screen. She hesitated, taking a breath before answering. "Mom," Jason said, his voice quiet, raw and heavy. "You were right, she was cruel." There it was, the admission that had never come before, the quiet realization that hung between them like an unfinished sentence. Corinne's fingers tightened around the phone. There was a long pause. "Jason," she said softly, her voice steady, her breath controlled. "It doesn't matter now, the truth is out, and I'm not the one who has to carry it anymore." She could hear him swallow, the silence filling the space between them. For a moment, Corinne thought he might say more, but then he didn't. She didn't expect him to. "I'll be okay," she added. The words weren't an affirmation, but a quiet declaration she would. The call ended with no further words, no apologies, but in that moment it didn't matter. She had already reclaimed what was hers. And no one, not even Jason or Vanessa, could erase that. The mentorship brunch was held in a small, sunlit hall at the local community center, the scent of fresh coffee and pastries filling the air. The room buzzed with conversation, a mix of eager young women and seasoned professionals gathered to listen, to learn, to be inspired. Corinne stood at the back, her silver gown replaced by a simple but dignified outfit, her posture just as strong as the day she'd stepped into that wedding hall. Her heart beat steadily, calm, as she watched the women before her. There was no fear now, no second guessing. It had been a month since the wedding, since everything had shifted, and though she had thought about this moment countless times, she had never once doubted it. She had never hesitated. Marcia had insisted, of course. "You're speaking, Corinne, it's time." But Marcia knew Corinne didn't need to be pushed, she was already here. When the call came, asking her to speak, Corinne had agreed without thinking twice. Dignity in silence. It was a title she had known for years, one she had lived with. The irony, though, was that silence had never been her enemy. Her silence had been her armor. As she stepped up to the podium, the room fell quiet. All eyes turned toward her, expectant, eager, and yet there was no trace of self-consciousness in her movements. The microphone squeaked as she adjusted it, her calm voice filling the space. "I want to thank you all for being here," she began, her words steady, measured. "I've been asked to speak today about dignity, how we hold it, how we define it, and how we protect it. I want to share a story with you, a story about strength, but it's not about what you see on the outside." She paused, letting her gaze wander across the room. The young faces in the front row were rapt with attention, others nodded, knowing instinctively that this was not going to be the typical sugar-coated speech they might have expected. I have a daughter-in-law who once thought she could humiliate me. She thought that a small act of cruelty, a public act, would break me. She shaved my head before her wedding, the day before, just to test how far she could go. The room was still, no one spoke, but Karen felt the tension rising as she continued, unflinching. Instead of breaking, I walked into that wedding the next day, head held high, proud, not a wig in sight. I didn't let her have the satisfaction of seeing me hide. I showed up, not for her but for me. Karen's eyes scanned the room. She didn't need to name names, everyone understood. The hurt, the betrayal, it was universal, and in her silence, her calm, she spoke volumes. As I stood there, I thought about all the things I had kept quiet about over the years, the things I swallowed to protect others. I learned that silence wasn't always weakness, it can also be power. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I didn't need to scream or shout, Karen continued, her voice now stronger, more assured. I didn't need to destroy anyone to feel worthy. I didn't need anyone's validation, not then and not now. She let the silence settle between her words, letting the weight of the truth fill the space. Her eyes flicked briefly to Ellie, sitting in the front row, her expression one of admiration. Karen's heart softened, the quiet pride in her chest swelling. This story, it's not about me, it's about you, all of you, the strength you carry when no one is watching, when no one is cheering you on. It's the quiet moments that define us, the ones that we make alone. There was a long pause. For a brief moment, Karen felt the room shift, the power of her words settling into the air like dust. She had given them what they needed, not a hero's tale, but the truth of surviving. When the applause came, it wasn't thunderous. It was quieter, more reverent. Karen looked out at the faces, young women nodding, older women wiping their eyes, a collective understanding in the air. They didn't need her to be anything more than who she was. After the speech, Ellie stood and made her way to the front. Her small hand grasped Karen's. "This is my grandma, she's the strongest person I know," Ellie said softly, her voice thick with emotion. Karen's smile was slow, proud as she squeezed Ellie's hand. "Thank you, sweetheart," she whispered, leaning in to kiss her forehead. Later that evening, when the event was over and the young women filtered out of the hall, Karen's phone buzzed in her purse. It was a text from Marcia. "You were amazing today, Karen. That was a gift to them and to yourself. I knew you had it in you." Karen didn't respond immediately. Instead, she sat back in the car, the familiar comfort of the drive home wrapping around her like a warm blanket. But as the headlights cut through the night, a familiar thought crossed her mind. She had spoken her truth today, and it was enough. Weeks passed, and the impact of her words still lingered. Ellie's friends asked about her, and Ellie would smile proudly, telling anyone who would listen, "My grandma gave the best speech. She's amazing." Jason and Vanessa quietly separated, though neither of them reached out to Karen. She didn't expect them to. The world didn't need her to apologize anymore. One morning, Karen sat with Marcia at their usual cafe, the warmth of their coffee mixing with the morning sun. "You know," Marcia said, a smile tugging at the corner of her lips, "that would have made one hell of a courtroom case." Karen's smile was small, but it was enough. She took a sip of her coffee, letting the stillness between them speak louder than any words could. "She shaved my head the day before her wedding," Karen said quietly. "But I showed up anyway. Turns out it wasn't me who looked exposed." The air was still, but there was a new kind of power in it, a power no one could take away.